I think it speaks volumes to our society that a whole generation is being told to swallow their conscience to stop fascism, as if that were the way that any of this worked.
Trump and all that comes with that represents a very sharp, hard turn towards fascism that will bring harm to millions of people almost immediately.
The roots of this fascism are so deeply entrenched in this system, and the system itself is the problem. And the opportunity to get rid of it, root and soil, is ripe.
Welcome to episode 202 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes, analyzes, and stands against the very real danger and threat of fascism coming to power in the United States. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. And while there's plenty to speak to in terms of developments from this past week as they relate to the accelerating fascist threat, from Texas Governor Greg Abbott pardoning the murder of Garrett Foster, who was murdered for attending a Black Lives Matter protest, to Alito flaunting his contempt for liberal democracy, to Trump's NRA speech, we'll make sure to focus extra on updates next week, because right now we are directly taking on the question, what will it take to stop fascism in the United States? On the show, we value diverse perspectives and will continue to explore the questions. What role do elections play in addressing the fascist threat in 2024? What does that mean for how the next 6 months to a year is going to play out? How can all of us who do not want to see a fascist America take action now and prepare for the struggle ahead? We'll tackle these questions from different angles, bringing on different guests with different understandings and coming from different fields of expertise, all with the aim of building a community with the understanding and resolve to prevent the consolidation of fascism in the U.S. Sound like something more people need to hear? Well, then chip in today to help this podcast reach more listeners, to help folks understand and act to refuse fascism. Become a patron for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/refusefascism, or make a one-time gift by visiting refusefascism.org and hitting the donate button. So let's get to it.
Last week, I posed that Trump and the MAGA movement, which, let's be clear, is the entire GOP at this point, is on a crusade to bring their cruel vision of the future to life. The Republic fascists are poised to retake the White House and never leave. They have mapped out their route to victory, this time likely no coup required. The open questions: what must be done to stop them and map out and arrive at a different future? Or, in other words, how the heck do we stop the careening fascist nightmare that is out for blood and threatens all of humanity? And what does voting have or not have to do with that? To get into this Coco Das is joining me. Hooray! Hey, Coco. And we are welcoming back onto the show Dr. Clarence Lusane and Sunsara Taylor. This is going to be an ongoing conversation on the pod, and we are so glad to get this started with our guests today. Dr. Clarence Lusane recently joined us on the podcast to talk about just how cataclysmic a Trump return to the White House would be. Dr. Lusane is a political science professor and interim political science department chair at Howard University and independent expert to the European Commission Against Racism and Intolerance. He is the author of many books, including The Black History of the White House and his latest $20 and Change, Harriet Tubman and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice and Democracy.
And Sunsara Taylor helped initiate Refuse Fascism in the aftermath of the election of Trump in 2016. She is a co-host of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show and is an advocate of the new communism forged by Bob Avakian. She mobilized and led tens of thousands into the streets against the overturning of Roe v. Wade with Rise Up for Abortion Rights.
So we're so excited to welcome you both on. Thanks for coming on, Dr. Lusane and Sunsara.
I'm very happy to be here. Really looking forward to it.
All right. Well, we're going to jump in with a question to both of you. So, as we know, Trump was issued an electoral defeat in 2020. And we can see that that accomplished certain things and didn't accomplish other things, mainly not stopping the movement that Trump leads. Given how things are developing in the world, I want to talk a little bit about stopping fascism. What do you see as different or the same this time around going into this election, 2020, 2024? What's changed? What's the same? And is there actually the potential of the election to put us on a different path? So I was wondering if you could both speak to that. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Lusane?
I would begin by saying that the 2016 and the 2020 and 24 elections are different because Trump is in a different position over these three elections. In 2016, even Trump did not think he was going to win. And certainly the establishment wing of the Republican Party felt that they could control him. That clearly was an illusion. Trump built the MAGA movement in between 2016 and 2020. The Republicans do not have the popular support in the country, so that equated with the Electoral College turnout in 2020. But Trump continued to build. What we see now is that the Republican Party is the Trump Party. There's virtually no opposition of any magnitude within the Republican Party. It's consolidated itself around Trump. And now heading into the 2024 election, we see a concerted effort to build this movement and institutionalize it in ways that did not happen during Trump's first term. And you have the Trump platform. You look at Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation. You look at Project 47, which is another effort to plan to populate a next Trump administration. And you look at all of these entities that call themselves America First. American First Legal, American First Policy Initiatives. All of this did not exist in 2016 and 2020. So there is a much, much more dangerous element to the MAGA movement now that in many ways goes beyond Trump. If Trump falls over today, this movement will continue at this point because it sees a major political party in the country with all the resources and access to electoral power that implies.
Sunsara, how would you respond to that?
I appreciate a lot of what Dr. Lusane laid out. I think he captures well the way that the fascist Republicans, Trump and beyond him, have captured fully the Republican Party. They purged the party of anybody who denies the big lie that he won the last election, anybody who stood in the way of the coup attempt that he attempted and could have carried out, could have succeeded in 2020. I think, you mentioned it's true that I was one of the co-initiators together with others of Refuse Fascism, recognizing early on that the Trump-Pence regime at that time was a fascist regime. And it was not just the most extreme collection of right-wing reactionary policies. What they were going for was a qualitative change in the form of government in this country to an outright fascist rule, an openly terroristic form of rule, which either completely shreds the separation of powers, the rule of law, and any constraints, or completely perverts the institutions and turns them into instruments of fascist atrocity, such that whole groups of people are denied even the semblance of basic rights. And so we initiated this movement with the recognition that there needed to be mass, determined political resistance and struggle of millions in the streets to stop and to drive this regime from power. It was illegitimate and it had to be stopped through a force of millions of people rising up. And you saw movements like this driving out hated regimes in other parts of the world. It's not unheard of. It's been done. It needed to happen here. As we got close to the 2020 election, we continued to try to bring people forward to stop what was clear Trump was on track to do. He was promising to do. He said in advance, I won't accept an election that I lose, which he's saying again now. And we still continued to try to mobilize people in the streets against that. I came at this, and I still come at this, with the recognition that this fascism and the atrocities that Trump is a concentration of are rooted in the deeper nature of this system and this country. The white supremacy, the male supremacy, the terror and conquest of this country across the world. And I've never thought that elections were the principal means or even the essential means through which decisions of this country and this empire are made. They're a way that the people are brought into participating in choosing which variety of oppressors and capitalist imperialist rulers will preside over this system and carry out the same basic function. In 2020, as a secondary aspect of continuing to build mass struggle and mass protest to stop Trump from coming back for a second term, myself taking leadership from Bob Avakian, the revolutionary leader and architect of the new communism, said this is a rare exception where we should cast the vote for Biden as a secondary aspect to create a stronger foundation for people to reject attempts of Trump to win or to steal the election and to consolidate a fascist form of rule. I participated in that election for the first time in decades. I voted in a presidential election as a secondary aspect. But I think what's changed, and I think Dr. Lusane did speak to this, is that one, the Trump program and apparatus and social base and grip within the institutions of power across this country is so much further advanced that I do not think that there's the same basis for mass struggle or even a voting against him to prevent him and this movement from going all out to impose their rule. But the other thing is I think that we are now in a period where the crisis and the divisions among this country, the rulers and the population in this country are so deep that there's very likely to be an all-out fight over the direction of society between the rulers and among the population in a way we haven't seen since the Civil War in this country. And out of a situation like that, there's possibilities that haven't existed for generations to actually wage a struggle which would defeat fascism, but would be waged on a revolutionary basis to bring the system down. And so that's a big idea. It's a big conversation, but I want to introduce it early on because I think that the roots of this fascism are so deeply entrenched in this system, and the system itself is the problem. And the opportunity to get rid of it, root and soil, is ripe or potentially ripe in a period like this in a way that it hasn't been. And that's a qualitative difference from 2020 till now.
Thank you. We will continue this conversation, and if either of you want to add more or respond, you're free to do so at any point. And then Sam is going to direct a question at each of you.
So I'm going to start with a question for you, Dr. Lusane, from Election Day. With Trump, the presumptive nominee, he has not faced a day in court for his coup attempt 3.5 years ago, let alone any of the more deadlier crimes he committed while in power. And in the Republic-Fascist Party's time out of the White House and not behind bars, they've revamped, as you've talked about, and they've planned. They've learned from mistakes that they made to consolidate fascist rule quickly and efficiently. And they are prepared to retake power by hook or by crook, making clear, as Sunsara and I think you also alluded to, that they won't accept any election outcome that doesn't declare them the winner. Trump eerily echoing, his January 6th speech, saying, if it's an honest election, I'll accept, but we have to fight for our country. Almost verbatim what he said before they stormed the Capitol. Given this, on the one hand, and that the U.S. has not been this divided since the run-up to the Civil War, I was hoping you could talk more about how the electoral framework, specifically voting for Joe Biden, can resolve these contradictions and stem the fascist tide.
One is not just Trump saying, I will not accept the results of the election. In 2016, he didn't accept the election that he won. He claimed that he still got more than he did. And certainly in 2020, Sunsara pointed out. But now what you have is pretty much the price of the ticket into Trump world, which is basically the Republican Party, is election denial. This election is not going to resolve that. Whether Trump wins or whether Biden wins, there will be tens of millions of people who will still be on the Trump and MAGA train. We have to think 2025, not just 2024. As Sunsara points out, this is long-term, deeply embedded kinds of views that have consolidated themselves into this political moment. What's unfolding then is a real battle over not who wins the election, but where will the country go 7 months, 8 months, a year from now? And there will be a rapid transition this time by the Trump administration coming in with no clearer sense that they will ever leave. We need to put that on the table as well. So we need to have these discussions. To me, there is not necessarily a conflict between electoral politics and movement politics. They interact with each other, and clearly surrendering election to the most right-wing fascist forces does not make a lot of sense. But we have to go in with a clear sense of not only at the national level, but when we look at cities and we look at states where there's much more opportunity for movement politics to take hold at this point, and you have people with socialist and progressive politics who have won city council seats, who have won other battles. We have to take all of that into account, because the folks even to the right of Trump are running for office. They're running for governors. They're running for state legislatures. They all have to be defeated as well. So it's a massive kind of undertaking, but it is creating a moment where in great crisis, there's great opportunities. But that's going to be dependent upon the degree to which our side can consolidate both around clear objectives and then effective strategies.
Thank you for that. Did you want to jump in, Sunsara?
Dr. Lusane spoke to a tremendous amount of what I was thinking about what we're facing, in particular when you said that what's most decisive is not so much what happens in the electoral sphere in this period. You have tens of millions of people who already believe Trump won the last election, who love that he's out there saying he'll be their retribution. These are people who really believe what Trump says, the outright fascist Klan slogan, "Make America Great Again," which has always meant make America white. Not just white, but openly white supremacist, openly patriarchal. It wasn't Trump got elected in spite of grab her by the pussy. That was part of the appeal to the social base of revenge against women and the changes in the social status of women and LGBTQ people in society. This is a big part of what he delivered with the Supreme Court and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. With the enslavement of women, forced motherhood is female enslavement in almost half the states in this country, and the fundamental rights of women ripped away nationwide as a protected right. There's tens of millions of people who are thrilling at his talking about immigrants poisoning the blood of America. They are chomping at the bit to come back. And exactly as Dr. Lusane said, Trump has stripped down his operation at this point, and he's purged anybody, and the Republican Party has purged anybody who would be a roadblock to this. Even Mike Pence was not hardcore enough for him. That's an outright theocratic Christian fascist, okay? They've purged anybody who was against this. And they're going to go for it. Whoever wins the election, they're going for this. And I think, Sam, in your question, you mentioned that this country has not been this divided since before the Civil War, and that's absolutely true. It's also true that those divisions, just like in the run-up to the Civil War, there were compromises, there were agreements reached tentatively here and there, but at a certain point, the social fabric rips open. You cannot have two countries in one continue indefinitely. That will come to a head. And I believe whether it comes to a head in the lead up to the election, whether there even is an election, whether there's some pretense to cancel it, or whether it happens through the election or in the wake of the election, it is very, very likely that this will come to a head or make a real leap towards that in the period through this election. What is most decisive is, again, not what happens in the electoral arena, but when there's an all-out fight over the future direction of society, over the form of rule in this society. To me, the most deadly thing possible would be if the decent people in society, the people who do not want to live under a fascist America, who also are horrified by the genocide that's being perpetuated and backed by Joe Biden and the entire ruling class of this country that Israel is carrying out against the Palestinian people. If the decent people in this country confine themselves to choosing between one side or the other of the rulers of this country, rather than seizing on the fight amongst them, to lift our sights to and fight for a revolution and a whole different way to live a fundamentally different system, which is what I am fighting for, what Bob Avakian has developed a strategy and a vision of a new society for, an actual revolution that gets beyond this system. And in that fight, we absolutely need to mobilize and unite with everybody who wants to stand up against the fascist terror, which we've already been seeing at the school boards, at those who oversee the vote count, and I'm sure at polling places in the election this time. Trump is calling for that kind of violence as well. We're going to have to unite with and put our bodies on the line and stand against the attacks and the violations of people's rights in their lives. But for myself, and I think for people who want to live in a world where the kinds of crimes that have been built into this country and that we see coming to a grotesque level with Trump and everything he's promising and with what Biden is prosecuting, backing Israel right now, this is the time for us to lift our sights to and get organized so that we wage this fight on a revolutionary basis. We're in a historic turning point. And I think I probably have different content. Maybe there's overlap, I don't know, but probably different content I'm putting to what Dr. Lusane said about it holds tremendous dangers, but also heightened possibilities for something positive. I definitely agree with that. This is how I see that.
Thanks for that. I did want to lift up two things, and then I want to pose a question to Sunsara. One of the things is that the intimidation has already begun in terms of voting, not just the efforts to subvert the vote, the seeding of election denial, but there's already been militia at ballot drop boxes in the non-presidential election. To think of what will happen in November, I know that both of you take that very seriously, what the implications are, but I still think that there's a lot of dismissing and wishing away what is very likely in terms of those who feel like this is their last shot. And for those people, I'm talking about the fascists. And just to respond to something that Sunsara was saying about the country being ripped apart and it's going to go one way or another, I think right now what most people see, if they're willing to look, is the direction of something truly horrific, where there would not be a tremendous struggle from the other side, from the decent people who would be scared and back down, or because they're the people who believe in democracy, who believe in the norms and institutions of this country, that they will cling to them more fiercely and therefore say, you know what, I guess it's yours, and give up the future. And I think that that's something that I think we need to struggle against. And in this context of this conversation, I'm talking about struggle politically with people. Dr. Lusane had talked about not wanting to surrender to the worst. I think that that is a really good segue to what I wanted to ask Sunsara. America's two-party system has endured for 150 years. Even during the height of the 60s, there was no viable challenge to the Democrats and Republicans. Many argue that since the specter of fascism is so grave, even genocide must be put aside to vote for Biden. Many of those explain that they are not voting for Biden, or definitely not for the genocide, but to deliver a decisive defeat at the ballot box to Trump. As historian Rick Perlstein put it, to stave off World War III and the extinction of our species. Can't voting for them help at least prevent something worse? The something worse being brutal repression, even annihilation of those Trump sees as quote unquote enemies from within, and turn back the clock on any possibility of change, let alone revolutionary change.
Okay, so there's, I think, two parts of what you raise I want to speak to. One is, I really believe that it is a false choice to say you're going to either accept the Trump fascism or you're going to have to hold your nose and vote for a genocide Joe. Rafah, they cut off the limited aid. They blocked the one way in Rafah right now. 300,000 people just in the last few days who have been flooded to the bottom of Gaza, driven from their homes. The rest of the 26 miles of Gaza have been reduced to rubble, and there's 1.5 million people packed in there, 600,000 of them children, and now the food is cut off, and they're being bombed and shelled. The hospitals have been shut down. There's no fuel. The one place that had mildly functional hospitals, this is intentional starvation being inflicted on people en masse. That's not a choice. First of all, it's not a moral choice. On a material level, scientifically, the crimes of Biden and actually the entire U.S. ruling class, Republican and Democrat, in backing Israel and this, what's been an apartheid state and what is now a genocide that they're carrying out, are rooted in the same system, the system of U.S. capitalism, imperialism, that has given rise to the deep roots of structural, cultural, and deep roots of white supremacy that are foundational to this country and defining to its ongoing functioning, no matter who is president, and which Donald Trump wants to take to a whole different open level. These things and the patriarchy, the misogyny, these things are rooted in the same system. So rather than picking between which poison from the same poisonous root, let's dig it up. Let's get beyond it. It's the same source of the problem. But the other thing is, in terms of staving off World War III, you don't have a winning ticket with Biden. The New York Times just ran a new look at the intensifying conflict, and there's a very dangerous situation in the South China Sea between U.S. and China. People are warning of the danger of nuclear war there. There's the proxy war that Biden is backing in Ukraine against nuclear-armed Russia. There's the fact that what's happening in Israel could spin out of control. We've already seen missiles back and forth between Iran and Israel with the U.S. in there. The danger of World War III is not averted with Biden. The extinction of the planet is not averted with Biden or with Trump. This is rooted in the system itself again. I have to say that when there is a fight, when this country and its stability and its norms and something like the peaceful transfer of power, which is a profound norm that has been a legitimizing norm of this country for 150 years, when that's being ripped up and the rulers are deeply fighting amongst themselves, this is the time for the people, when those norms are breaking down, the things that have made people believe that this country is somehow better, somehow great, somehow unique, somehow a good nation. When those norms are breaking down, people are questioning. This is the time to lead them to look at the roots of this and the actual alternative in a different system, a radically different system. And I think we've seen the potential for this. In 2020, the beautiful 16 million people in the streets against police terror, institutionalized racism, and murder. We've seen tens of thousands of people in the streets against the overturning of women's right to abortion. We've seen right now students, including at the elite universities, especially at the elite universities, losing their allegiance to the crimes of this system, defecting in very deep ways. There's potential in this country. It's not a pipe dream to make a revolution. There does need to be a changed transformation of people's understanding of what problem they need to attack and what solution. And on this, there's nothing parallels the social media dispatches that Bob Avakian has been putting out that go to the roots of this, at Bob Avakian Official, analyzing this and what we need to do and how revolution could be possible. But I think you don't buy yourself time, first of all, in this period, because Trump and the fascists are not backing off no matter who wins. But also Biden is now the winning ticket on these things. And out of their fight, you have the possibility, if we get organized, if we lift our sights, to actually get to a whole different kind of society, a whole different way to live. And that's a rare thing in a country as stable, as powerful as this country is. Usually. Stable, usually, as this country is. Powerful as it remains.
I think that's a good segue to my next question. I'd like to pivot a little bit, but Sam, you want to say something?
I just wanted to open up the opportunity for Dr. Lusane to respond.
So a couple of things. Sarah mentioned how we fight back, and part of it is using a term that's a little bit old, but united front, and building across movements, building across interests, the fight back against fascism. When we look at fascism and anti-fascist movements around the world, these were united campaigns where you had people who were socialists, who were progressive, people who were conservatives, who sort of like democracy. It was a broad front that was required in order to beat back the hardline, take no prisoners, destroy everything, fascist movements that have been out there. So that really is what confronts us. How do we build that in this country? In terms of the election, we basically have less than 6 months. In this country, anybody that's voting has a choice of who they vote for. There's no question about it. You can vote for a major party. You can vote for a minor party. You can write in yourself. Where we really don't have a choice is that unless something unforeseen happens, either Joe Biden or Donald Trump is going to be the president. They bring different things and different opportunities and different situations to the country. Trump and all that comes with that represents a very sharp, hard turn towards fascism that will bring harm to millions of people almost immediately with pretty much no relief in sight. We haven't talked about what it means in terms of having Congress and who controls Congress and what kind of ways that might operate. But that's kind of one side of it. The other side of it is the Democratic Party, which has its long history of clearly representing corporate America and all of that. But it also has been a basis under which broad movements have been able to push through many of the gains that we won in the 20th century, whether it's around racial justice, environmental control, women's issues, and so forth. And so in that context, the terrain on which we want to be a year from now can be very, very different depending on who gets into power, none of which changes our overall objectives, what we're trying to do and what we're trying to put in place.
Well, I wanted to split up the next question, Sam, into two, one for Sunsara and one for Dr. Lusane. I wanted to shift a little to talking about mass struggle and protest. And Sunsara, I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier about the fascism becoming so solidified and advanced in terms of, not only the party and different institutions, but also the base, that the basis for mass struggle is not the same as it was in 2016, certainly. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, the role of, mass struggle in this time. And also, what does it mean that we're seeing the biggest student uprising around Gaza? I think people have a lot of ideas about what it means for Biden's election chances, but what does it mean in terms of a fight for the future and a fight against fascism? I was wondering if you could speak to that.
There's one thing I want to just touch on and go back to. I think it's often said, well, at least if you have Democrats, you have a party in power that might listen if you put pressure on them. I think this is kind of at the tail end of what Dr. Lusane was saying. And I think in this situation with the Trump fascists, there is a qualitative change in the form of rule that they are trying to impose that is outright fascism, and it would be different. So that I don't want to deny. But I think historically, I don't know that assumption about the Democrats adds up. And this is where the mass struggle and mass resistance does play a huge role. If you look at the struggle against the Vietnam War, for example, principally the U.S. was defeated by the Vietnamese liberation fighters there, but there was a massive struggle here in this country, too, that was among the students, then among the soldiers, then more broadly in society. It was actually Nixon who had to withdraw the troops, not a Democrat. He actually won campaigning for the war, and then he had to withdraw the troops because bigger things were deciding what happened. It was under Nixon that the Supreme Court granted Roe v. Wade. Because of the struggle that was being waged by people around the world, because of different necessity that the rulers of this country and its institutions were confronting, and because of the struggle waged within this country. And I think in the converse, you could look at somebody like Bill Clinton. I remember when everybody, after the Reagan years, after the Bush years, I remember when I was kind of young and my whole family was so enthusiastic about Clinton. He was pro-choice. He was had an affinity. Everybody thought for black people, all of this. What did he usher in, though? Was the whole regime of mass incarceration, the ending welfare as we know it. There was more restrictions on abortion rights and access and more violence done to abortion clinics than there had been in the previous presidencies. And part of what happened is progressive people quieted down because they thought they had a friend in the White House. I think the same pattern repeated under Obama. He got away with all kinds of crimes. He bombed 7 countries and he didn't get the same kind of resistance and opposition that George Bush did. I think that what's more decisive in setting the policies for the rulers is the necessity they face with rival imperialist powers, different challenges around the world, economically, militarily, geostrategically, and the internal makeup of their country, including, not reducing to, but including the struggles that are waged, no matter who is in power. I think that's historically bears out. I know that there are particularities at different points. That's one thing I wanted to speak to. And then the other thing, just in terms of your question about the significance of the student struggle right now, which really is unprecedented, the struggle on the elite campuses and more broadly in society against the U.S. support for Israel's genocide in Gaza is unprecedented. We've not seen something like this in generations that is so much up against something that is so core and so strategic and so integral to the U.S. imperialist empire's functioning and domination in the world. In the strategic area of the Middle East, the U.S. can't back away from this. They're even more deeply tethered to Israel in this time with the rising imperialist competition from China, Russia, the regional competition from Iran. They're even more tied to backing Israel in this time to maintain their domination of that strategic region than the U.S. was, I think, in some ways to Vietnam. They were able to back away from that. They didn't want to, but they had to at a certain point. This struggle is up against something that is so core to the U.S. at a time that it's being challenged internationally. I think it's part of why their crackdown, the repression, has been so disproportionate. I don't think this is principally driven by pro-Israeli trustees. I know there are trustees at all these university boards who are pushing for this repression, but I think it comes from higher up. I think that the rulers of this country are very threatened by this. And I think strategically it's very favorable for people seeing potentially the deeper nature of this country, this society, and the need to get rid of a society and a system that could do this. And the rulers are also very fearful. This is something that Bob Avakian pointed out, drawing from his experience back in the free speech movement at Berkeley in the 60s, is how afraid the rulers are and how much we should take heart in and push forward what happens when the rulers lose the allegiance of students at the elite universities, and how that could spread throughout society, how that could encourage questioning and struggle among different sections of people. And that's something we should seize on, because I do believe that there's tremendous need for mass struggle, mass protest against the fascism, against the genocidal war, against many of the crimes from both sections of the rulers. At the core of this, we have to be opening up a major debate, some of the kinds of questions we're getting into here, over what's the source of this? Could a revolution be made? What would you replace the system with? Is there an alternative? And how could this be done, including in the kind of historic turning point and crucible that we are very likely headed into in this coming period?
Thank you for that. Dr. Lusane, I want to give you a chance to respond to the student protests. You had also talked about the United Front. In the podcast, we've talked about the coalition of the decent. What more would that look like? What would that coalition or United Front be doing? But I also was wondering if you could speak to another question, which is there are people who are opposed to the genocide in Gaza who argue that these protests, in particular the encampment protests, could cost Biden the election. And, sometimes this is coupled with something like, would you rather be protesting for Gaza under Biden or Trump? I was wondering what you think of that logic, but also if you could speak to this idea of mass struggle and mass protest and the student protests in particular.
A really important question. Quickly, I would say, in response to Sunsara, a couple of points. It's really critical to not see correlation as causation. So even though Roe v. Wade was decided under Nixon, it was not Nixon's appointees to the court that decided that. And similarly, although under Joe Biden, Roe has been rolled back, that's happened as a result of the appointments of Trump. So I just want to just kind of underline, those correlations in particular. As Sunsara says, these protests and these student uprisings are absolutely critical. And they do reflect an important recognition that not only what Israel is doing is completely unacceptable, but that support by the U.S. and the other Western powers make them complicit in all of the genocide and harm that's going on in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere. And so that needs to be acknowledged. Their sustainability, to me, is something to kind of have some concern about. Most recently, for example, the 2020 protests around police brutality, which were some of the largest and most stained in world history, not just in U.S. history, but in world history. But their sustainability, we saw, became an issue. So it's really critical to think through how do you build on these moments in ways that become organizationally and institutionally sustainable beyond sort of the high points. And so I think that's one of the things to be kind of focused on now. And how do you build that? And I'm not close enough to know to what degree student leaders, as what happened during Vietnam, come together and then become a very coordinated national movement as opposed to kind of individual campuses, kind of uprisings. That I would love to see, that kind of immersion, which goes to your second question of what this United Front would look like. It would mean bringing together these leaders from around the country, student leaders, people who are leaders of the LGBTQ community, civil rights leaders, Black Lives Matter movement leaders, people who are working on climate and environmental issues. It means finding mechanisms by which these grassroots leaders who are leaders in these local areas, in these cities and these states can meet and begin to strategize more long-term. How do you start to bring about clear policy changes that really do reflect where people want to go. Those kinds of efforts are really, to me, what's critical right now, while there is a sense of urgency. And particularly to me, because one of my areas is foreign policy, there are other areas in the world, like in the Congo, for example, or in Haiti, for example, that are being ignored, and just unbelievable kind of death and harm going on in these other areas. There needs to be a way in which all of this kind of is brought together, and it's not sort of the issue of the moment, but that, we bring all these issues together down the road.
I want to jump in and say, I think there's something really wrong and imprisoned in the imagination of people who pose the question the way that, would you rather be protesting a genocide under Trump or under Biden? First of all, why are we accepting that we're going to live in a world where your government is backing a genocide? If you have a government that is backing a genocide, you need to get rid of that system that it's representing. Or you have to ask, is it built in? Is it intrinsic? Can it be reformed away? And I think if you look at the history of this country, from slavery and genocide to the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan to Vietnam to the death squads and coups that the U.S. has backed all across Latin America to the crimes this country has committed again and again in the country of Haiti, and then you have to say, okay, there's something built into this. This is imperialism. It's a global system of exploitation and conquest. And the U.S. has been in competition with other rival imperialist powers for spheres of influence and conquest. And we can get beyond a world. So first of all, there's something wrong with the question like that, but there's also something wrong with the idea, as long as we have to live under this system, I would rather live in a society where students are rising up against the crimes of their government, asking the question, why is this happening? Waking others up, because we live in an imperialist empire. We live at the top of the imperialist global food chain. People are able to ignore the blood of people and child slaves in Congo that are what make the coltan in the phones and the electric cars run. They're able to ignore what all this rests on day to day. But when you have resistance and protest and people standing up and saying no and putting their bodies on the line and putting their careers and their futures on the line the way these students are doing, it inspires and challenges and wakes other people up. And I would rather, as long as we have to live under this system, be in a situation where that is fostered and encouraged. And people are then debating, what is the source of this? Can we get beyond this? Is the most we can do to then translate this into some policy changes within this system? Or can we actually bring this system down at long last, lift it off the backs of humanity, and implement a real viable socialist revolutionary alternative that is not exploiting and plundering the world, that's not destroying the environment, that is working in cooperation with liberation struggles around the world and building up an economy based on meeting people's needs, and an education system and a media system and a political system that fosters debate over what's true and encourages people's participation, transforming society and uprooting the forms of oppression that we have inherited from living under this system that we have just overthrown. Like, let's have that debate and let's make it real. I believe people rising up in the streets makes that so much more possible. And I think that it makes it so much more possible to beat back the crimes and minimize the crimes as long as we have to live under this system. And I also think that part of the reality is that no movement will be sustainable for long term under this system, because the system itself, it has its dynamics. The system cannot stop its police from carrying out their murders. People were right in 2020. They rose up against it, but they were wrong to think you could defund the police and get rid of this problem within this system. That was a misunderstanding of what would lead to the result. You want to end the police murder and terror, you have to get rid of the system that requires them to carry that out. That's part of the debate we have to open up, is what would it take to get to a world not just where the movements are sustained, but where the crimes the movements grew up to fight are actually stopped and no more.
I want to thank you both for speaking so richly to that question, which, Coco, you posed, that I think is something that people hear a lot, that we've heard a lot. And I think it speaks volumes to our society that a whole generation is being told to swallow their conscience to stop fascism, as if that were the way that any of this worked, is just deeply, deeply upsetting. Before we give you space to bring up anything that we didn't bring up in our conversation already, I just wanted to share from one of the other folks on the podcast team, and I asked her to share some of the questions that she had to be part of posing this, and I'm going to slightly reword what she said, but I thought that there was a lot to it. There is a whole generation realizing that, these are her words mainly, realizing both wings of the ruling class are more than anything beholden to the needs of empire, and that they have basically agreed to what amounts to this quote-unquote war on the world framework from the Bush era, that with some disagreements, like Obama not supporting the quote-unquote stupid war in Iraq that Biden, Clinton, etc. all supported, which has resulted in endless drone bombings, basically no strings attached funding for whatever Israel wants to do, including the current genocide in Gaza. It shatters the good idea of a good team versus bad team, which is how people are raised up to see things. The question is asked, what is better? Hypocritically saying you want to defend liberty and democracy while doing all these horrific things, or just nakedly admitting you're a monster, overseeing a monstrous system that does horrific things to people all over the world? The answer to this that I get from people like this is that we should work towards our own electoral platform. She's asking, how do you answer this proposal, assuming this is an honest opinion and not some kind of opportunistic disguise for a proven dead end? Some have talked about how those who are experts and really studied what happened in the 60s about the parallels between 1968 and the current political stew of widespread youthful alienation from a war-prosecuting Democratic Party in power, and how that led to LBJ essentially stepping down and the ascendancy of Richard Nixon. They've been answering these experts, by saying that the stakes are just much higher this time, and the tables are so much more stacked against the people this round. So it doesn't appear possible to persuade people to participate in the get out the vote effort on the scale that happened in 2020, nor would that be a moral approach, given what it means to line up to support for genocide. Joe, but what does this mean for how the next 6 months to a year is going to play out in terms of state power in the U.S.?
Anybody who thinks, look, they're both bad choices and one's just hypocritically says they're for inclusion and rights, but they'll trample them, and the other one says they're going to openly be a monster, so there's no difference. And I've heard actually a number of people say, and including increasing numbers of Black people, it's not a majority, but increasing numbers of Black people who say, well, at least Trump is honest about it. He's open about it. We know they're both racist, but at least he's open. I think anybody who negates the fact that there is a qualitative difference between this Trump fascist who said bring back the death penalty about the Central Park Five, who said, why can't I shoot the Black Lives Matter protesters in the knees? Why can't I call out the military? Anybody who doesn't get there's a qualitative difference is not really being reality based. You know, you might think you're being very woke or left, or I know they're all the same. The rulers are just wrong. They are all ruling class imperialist oppressors. None of them are any good, but there are qualitative differences between them. And we have to recognize the qualitative danger and the fact that this side of the ruling class that is concentrated in Trump and these fascists are not backing down this time. And they have a social base of millions. And they probably do have sections in the military who might go with them this time. We don't actually know. I think it would be very dangerous. I think the people who say, oh, you know, don't worry about that are gravely missing a major part of reality that we have to be awakened to. But at the same time, I will say they are all part of the ruling class and they are all committing crimes. And what's most significant right now and unprecedented is they are actually at each other's throats. I was thinking about as you were asking the question, there's so many crazy things happening all at once. People forget the break-in to Nancy Pelosi's house and the attack with a hammer on her husband that could have killed him, that Trump made fun of. What's he signifying with that? You know, lock her up. What's he signifying? Dictator for a day. I'm going to come after the vermin and the Marxists and all of this. And he's not just talking about actual Marxists, actual communists. He's talking about his opponents within the ruling structures of this country. These are Nazis. We're not going into a normal election period. Let me just put it that way. I don't know what it will look like. Nobody has a crystal ball. It's not scripted yet, but this is not a normal election. This is not a normal historical juncture. And the dangers are profound and unprecedented, but so is the necessity and actually the opportunity for the fundamental nature of this system that all of the rulers represent, even with their deep conflicts over how to enforce their rule, for that to be opened up for people to look at, for people to come to understand the nature of this, and for these heroic struggles that have been waged in the last few years, which show the potential for revolution. The 2020 upsurge, the mass walkouts of youth around the climate, this profound struggle right now against the U.S. support and the Israeli genocide in Gaza, which is really important and righteous and needs to be deepened, and everybody who's under attack needs to be defended. This is a time for people to lift their sights, to open up a debate about, can the system be reformed or must it be overthrown, and how could it be? Are we in a time when that's more possible? And I contend it is. I really urge everybody, whether you've ever thought about revolution before or not, to look at what's happening and to give an honest and a deep and a serious engagement to what Bob Avakian is putting out, particularly in his social media messages at Bob Avakian Official. He's been numbering them, and he walks through why we're in a rare time when revolution's possible, how it could be made. He goes deeply into this conflict in Gaza, a tremendous amount more. We cover this on the show that I co-host, the Revolution Nothing Less show on YouTube. Come and find us there at youtube.com/therevcoms. Keep listening to this podcast. Think about the world, but especially go into the work that Bob Avakian has done. Don't go through this historic juncture just locked within the terms and the possibilities set by this system. Lift your sights to a different system, a different way to live, and a strategy to get there, and then weigh it and debate it as you're going through this period and as we are uniting against the crimes that are being carried out day to day, even as we're still debating the solution.
Yep. So let me be a little bit historian and a little bit political sciencey here. So capitalism takes different forms. Depending on the form, it helps to determine the terrain on which you fight. After the crisis of the 1930s, it took on the form of welfare state capitalism, mostly in the West, because the only way the system could survive, it had to make compromises and deals with working class revolts around the world. That form of capitalism lasted all the way up until more or less the 70s, when, as Naomi Klein and others write about, neoliberalism surged and effectively has dominated from that time up to now. Where we're at is another turning point of all authoritarianism coming principally not just in the United States, but if you look at Italy, you look at a number of countries around the world that are making this turn. And what they are planning for next year, if they come back to power, 1 million deportations of people who they say are undocumented and don't belong in the country, reinstating the Muslim ban. And this time the Supreme Court will uphold it. They're trying to get rid of birthright citizenship. They're probably going to get rid of the Department of Education and EPA. So this is not a minimum turn. This is a very hard turn. The other element that comes into this is political violence. As we've seen from Trump speeches going back to 2016 to what happened January 6th and so forth, in a country where there are more guns than there are people, there is a very willingness to use political violence when there is a response by all of the good people to these machinations and these right-wing turns. All of that is what's on the table. Biden very well may lose significantly because of his position in supporting Netanyahu, an undefendable position which I understand many people cannot morally figure any way around it to vote for Biden. So he very well may lose, particularly as a result of that. The stakes are really, really, really high. Again, regardless of what happens in the election, we've got a fight on our hands. We've got a need for an anti-fascist movement that is not going away, even if Trump loses. That really, to me, is, where we keep our discussion and have people begin to look at ways, not only, I think, in terms of policy, but also in terms of constitutional reform. Because in part, the fact that we will have a Donald Trump is because the Constitution creates the mechanisms by which that can happen. There's no other constitution in the entire world that has an electoral college. And some of the other things that are in the U.S. Constitution, going back to 1789, that have not changed, that just bears complete nonsense. So all of that to me is on the table as we look down the next 6 months, but then look beyond those 6 months.
Well, I think we're at the end of a very rich hour-long discussion. I think one thing I want to end with is that we do have a fight on our hands, and you've both put out some really important things to get ready for as we go into these next 6 months, which, as Sunsara said, this is not a normal election season. We hope that this will open up a society-wide debate. One thing that's being posed here is, can this system that is, given rise to, I'll just put it plainly, Genocide Joe or Fascist Trump, can that system be reformed? If so, what would be the mechanisms, or can we make an actual revolution? Is it true that overthrowing the system is the way to actually resolve all this? We're not going to, settle all that here, but I want to thank you both for really bringing your best arguments, and we want to continue this discussion and make sure that a lot of people hear it and start to participate in it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sam.
I want to just echo everything that Coco just said, especially appreciate you both coming on to have this dialogue with us. One that this will not be the end of. This is just the beginning. And we're going to put in the show notes ways for people to follow more of your work, whether it's watching the RNL show or connecting to Dr. Lusane's writing. We will put them both all in there. And I just want to thank Dr. Lusane and Sunsara. Thank you for sharing your perspective, your insights, your time, and your passion with us, Coco and Sam, and with all of us listening.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure. Thank you, all of you. And Dr. Lusane, I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. I'm sure after today's episode, you have tons of thoughts. We'd love to hear them all. Let us know your thoughts. Post a comment or question on Spotify. Connect with us on social media. We're at Refuse Fascism on all the platforms, including Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky. Or over on YouTube, we are at Refuse_Fascism. So subscribe and comment there. Or leave us a voicemail. See the show notes for the button. If you want to reach me personally, I'd love to hear from you. Over on Twitter, you can find me at Sam B. Goldman. Drop me a line via Samantha Goldman at refusefascism.org. Find me on TikTok at Sam Goldman RF. We will continue to make this resource available as we always have, 100% free and accessible on as many platforms as we can. But this spring, we need your support. As people rightly agonize over what's happening and what's needed, your help is needed to publicize the show via podcast ads and social media. You can join us by becoming a patron for as little as $2 a month at patreon.com/refusefascism. If you aren't in a position to give monthly but want to support, we totally get it and appreciate you. Visit refusefascism.org and hit the donate button. You can also see the show notes for other methods to give. Whether you can give $2 or $20 a month, or $2 or $20 as a one-time donation, it all makes a difference in producing and promoting this independent, all-volunteer weekly podcast. Thank you for your support. And shout out to Rose A for becoming a production level patron. Thank you for your support of this show. And if you can't give now, share this show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on your socials or via YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. Thanks to Coco Das, Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkelman for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show. So be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.